Let me share my screen here. Can people see this?
Yeah.
Yep.
You can see clearly.
Okay, and I'll present. So a little bit of a different focus today. Honestly, it's quite a nice change. This year, obviously, we've been talking about 2020 and 2021 a lot because of everything that's been going on. So a little bit of a change of tack today, and I'm going to be talking about where we at IHS Markit see coal demand in the APAC region going forward about a decade. Key kind of takeaways for everybody in the audience. Obviously, this is a very grim year for coal demand globally. In the Asia Pacific region, it is certainly badly impacted too, but it is the one region that does have a few positives that do at least partially offset the negatives. In the outlook to 2030, import demand will grow. That should say to 2030, not to 2020. It's going to be a little bit of a different story by region though. It's going to decline in some of the traditional markets like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and mainland China. However, those declines we see as being more than offset by growth, particularly in India and Vietnam, and then also in a number of other countries throughout the region. We do think that APAC suppliers will be relatively comfortably able to meet the amounts of demand growth. Some little amount of competition coming from Atlantic suppliers where over the next 10 years the demand situation is far worse than in APAC. A very quick snapshot of 2020, and I'm just going to minimize that. We expect that thermal demand globally is going to be down about 90 million tons this year. And if you look at the chart on the left, you can see APAC countries are important components of this. India, we expect to be down about 40. Mainland China, about down to 10 or 12, very uncertain based on import restrictions. Other parts of Asia, generally down. And if you look on the far left there, the green bar is Vietnam, and we actually have that now at a plus 16 year on year, which is, it's really shown some very, very strong growth, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. On the right, I'm not going to go into detail on these. We have the suppliers and how we expect that those will be impacted. So just a little bit of a framework. I think many of you have probably seen those slides before. I thought it'd be useful just to go through kind of country by country, or in some cases groupings of countries, and just discuss our expectations. In this slide here, we show, I've kind of bundled Japan, Korea, JKT into one slide. And I'm showing our thermal import outlooks for each of these countries. And in each chart, you can see the ranks of coal. We forecast coal demand by quality, by rank. Now, all of these are net as received, and I know not everybody thinks in net as received, so apologies for that. But in general, each of these countries takes different types of coal. Japan takes high CV mostly. South Korea takes quite a lot of subbituminous. Taiwan somewhere in between. All of these, though, are showing we expect a trajectory that is down and to the right. They're going to decline over the next 10 years. But the other half of that takeaway is they're not going to decline rapidly, in our view. Now, Japan, we see a little bit of support in the near term, next few years, because of nuclear outages. That's obviously been a theme since Fukushima, going on 10 years ago now. And it's still continuing. The latest is that a number of nuclear plants are going to be offline to meet anti-terrorism compliance. And we see that buffering coal demand in the next few years. We see a bounce back from 2020, obviously a very bad year for, I think, every country here other than Vietnam. But after next year, it's going to be stable for a couple of years and then downward after that. South Korea, we've seen after a very strong 2017 and 2018, 29 was already showing signs of weakness with introduction of sulfur restrictions on imports. And in general, in recent years, a government that has been a little, definitely willing to lower coal demand, to say the least. So we do expect a little bit of a bounce back this year, but it's the one of these three, the decline we see being a little bit later. And partly that is because there's already been a level of a hit taken. Taiwan, also down and to the right. And a general theme really in all three of these, or two kind of themes, are a willingness to move away from coal a little bit more aggressively. Typically, these are wealthier countries that do have the capacity to kind of pay that environmental cost. And then also, particularly in Japan and South Korea, a developing theme of coal gas competition. Now, I'm sure most people are aware that coal gas competition has decimated coal demand in North America and in Europe. It's had little impact elsewhere, but certainly, we'll get, at any given time up to, 2-3 million tons of coal being displaced between Japan and Korea economically. And as exposure to spot LNG prices increases, as long-term oil index deals roll off, we do expect that amount that is able to switch to grow. But nevertheless, we think it's going to develop very slowly. I don't want to spend too long on any individual slide. Here's China. I'll be upfront, it's the single biggest uncertainty in our outlook, especially for the next couple of years. We expect that Chinese imports are going to be down this year, despite the strong stats in the first half of the year. And this is really being driven by import restrictions. We're already seeing building of pretty big vessel queues off the coast of China. We think that we will start seeing some months with lower import stats. So this year, I think, is going to be negative. It's worth saying that if imports were left unconstrained, they would be up, absolutely guaranteed. Imports are cheaper, and if the market is left to do what the market wants to do, then imports will grow. And that's probably the case for the next few years. But after, say, 2022 or 2023, one of the core themes we see driving the global seaborne market really is that we see China gradually moving away from imported coal. There's a lot of nuclear generation that's being built in coastal regions that are disinterested in having what are viewed as polluting power plants near them. Impact of hydro, a lot of build of LNG regas capacity, growth of coal by wire, high voltage power lines moving power rather than coal, and also better transportation of coal itself. And in general, we see, I think over the next couple of decades, coal demand in China, we don't think falls very much, but it's really a case of coal demand rising in the interior of the country and falling along the coast. And that's really the biggest single driver of the decline that we have on the left. Much more positive news, India. Very sawtoothed import pattern in recent years and looking forward. 2019 was a record for imports, and as I mentioned, we expect it to be hit the hardest of any country on the planet this year, owing primarily to COVID. Not just COVID though, we've had some rulings, albeit reactionary to COVID, around things like ash compliance, and those favor domestic coal as well over imports. So we expect this year to be down 40 million, but then to grow thereafter. Now, this is one of the areas that we see a little bit of a sea change in coal trade, where we see this year being very bad for Indian coal demand, but we think that it doesn't really impact the ability of the domestic Indonesian producers, primarily Coal India, to produce coal. So if Coal India isn't really impacted, but demand is down, and then demand grows from a lower level, it implies that Coal India has the ability to meet more of that domestic demand. And that is bad news for the international market. And it implies that imports into India won't get back to the trajectory that we used to expect. It's not one-to-one, right? There are certain plants, of course, that can only take imported coal. There are various drivers that mean it's not simply going to be every ton that could in theory switch will. But we do think that this reduces Indian imports 20 to 30 million tons a year relative to what they would have been if COVID-19 had not happened. And Indonesia is really the country that takes that hit because we do see this primarily being in the generation space and not as much in industrials. That said, the amount of growth here is absolutely staggering. We expect about 92 gigawatts of new capacity to come online by 2030. For perspective, that's about a third of the entire size of the United States power market at its peak 10 years ago. So enormous amounts of growth in coal demand, and we think that translates of growth of well over 50 million tons, I think 60 or 70 million tons from 2020's low to 2030. And the growth won't stop there. It will continue thereafter. And we do expect India to continue to grow through 2050. Vietnam, also very positive. Astonishing levels of growth this year, driven primarily by a very, very weak hydro year, but also just shortages of coal that have been topical for a number of years now and really came to a head last year. It's interesting. We talk about GDP a lot. Vietnam and China are two of the few countries in the world where we actually still expect GDP growth this year. And Vietnam's generally done quite a good job with respect to COVID-19. However, we think the second half will not see the levels of growth that we saw in the first half. And, there's very, very strong wet season that's already developed. And we've seen a recent rise in COVID cases. So some risks around that. We also think that the gains in imports this year will mute the degree of growth that we would have seen in 21 and 22 and 23. So we're kind of getting the gains now. We won't get as much of a gain later. And so in the chart on the right, we once would have had a fairly smooth kind of upward to the right trajectory. Now we have this big hump that you can see in 2020. And then a few years of slower growth, but we do get back to stronger growth later this decade. There are 10 gigawatts of coal plants currently under construction. They'll all come online by 2025. Another 10 are planned, but we see as very highly likely that will come online between 2025 and 2030. So an additional 20 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity just in one country. Interesting to note, I don't show it in this chart, but we do have imports into Vietnam really flatten out after 2030. We see a lot of challenges to building new capacity in Vietnam after that, primarily around capital and just the ability to make that decision. Do I invest in a new asset that I really need to be running fairly strong for 30 or 40 years? And can I make that decision come 2030, and can I convince financiers to back it? I think this is my second last slide. I'll get a wriggle on. In general, growth is common in the region. Even countries like Thailand, which have shown certainly appetite to move away from coal, we do expect modest amounts of growth. Quite strong growth in Cambodia. Philippines, obviously having a very hard time this year with COVID. That has impacted not only 2020 demand, but it's slowed down the building of some new coal-fired projects. And so that may hurt 2021, 22 a little bit relative to prior expectations. And Malaysia, again, sort of ongoing but slow growth, albeit only really for the first half of the coming decade. We think it'll flatten out thereafter. My final slide, I think I'm sticking all right to 15 minutes here. It's interesting just to look at APAC's position in the world. And in the chart on the left, you can see in the light blue is Indian Ocean. And in the light green, Indian Ocean, light blue, Southeast Asia. And then in orange, East Asia. Now, if you put all three of those together, you see that those are growing. The three colors at the bottom are all Atlantic Basin and going to be declining through 2030. There's enough growth in APAC that it keeps the world growing in terms of seaborne coal demand through the end of the decade. And we see that peak being 2029, after which it plateaus. Look, I won't get into individual suppliers, but I put them in the deck so that people can have a look. You can certainly see Indonesia in there. We don't expect that Indonesia will be exporting kind of 450 to 455 a year, which was our previous expectation. We're now down, I think, 420, 425, 430 kind of range. And still a pretty strong export story, just not quite as strong as we had expected previously. With that, I'll hand back to Pahendra.